Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Honourable youth members, I respectfully acknowledge that we are sitting today on the land of Aboriginal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I thank them as first Australians for their careful custodianship of the land over countless generations. We're very fortunate in this country of ours to have two of the world's oldest continuing living cultures in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whose lands, winds and waters we all now share. Honourable youth members, I am really pleased again to welcome you to the Eric Deeral Youth Parliament. This, of course, is the time when the rubber hits the road and you're in the chamber. And it's where you can make sure that you tell all of your peers and those people who are very keenly watching what your speeches have looked like as they've come together. This program, of course, has been operating since 2009, and in 2012 the Indigenous Youth Parliament was renamed the Eric Deeral Indigenous Youth Parliament in honour, of course, of our first Aboriginal member in the House here in the Legislative Assembly. So since this program commenced in 2009, there's been over 400 Indigenous participants sit in these chambers who've spoken on mock bills, adjournment debates, matters of public interest in their respective communities. And today it will be your turn. This opportunity, of course, as I said earlier, is about making sure that you are measuring yourself against yourself and nobody else. You've heard already, timing is not going to be an issue, it's a guide. We want you to speak carefully, slowly, considerably, and making sure that you do your very best in terms of your delivery. Obviously, we want you to encourage your fellow youth members, and it's a really important thing that they know that what they're saying is valued, and you're able to demonstrate that by giving them here. Of course, as I said before, we have had plenty of people come through this program. This year's group, from what I've observed and when speaking with some of you, are a very bright group, and it's great to see just how engaged you are in the process. Obviously, our parliamentary democracy is a really important part of what we do as a community, because the laws that are made here in the real parliament impact the lives of every single Queenslander. So you're getting a taste of that today, albeit a small one, but obviously it's something that you may wish to consider in the future. However, it's not for everybody, and there are plenty of ways you can get active in your communities. Obviously, demonstrating great community spirit, making sure that you are engaging in local issues that are of importance to you, getting involved in a lobby group, starting a petition, whatever it may be. We always say that our democracy is a participation sport. You do have to get involved. And so in whatever way that is, we hope that you do that and you take some things away from the program that you've been involved with today. In terms of previous participations, we had Tanisha Backer-Honeyman, who attended this QIYLP in 2017, and to quote Tanisha, she said, "The moral of my story is that from writing that speech in Parliament for the Queensland Indigenous Youth Parliament, then being brave enough to stand up and present it, I found my true passion and purpose, and I wouldn't have had the confidence to pursue it without it." So hopefully you'll have some very similar thoughts in terms of how you go today. Without further ado, will call the Youth Premier.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the House today for bestowing the high honour of premiership upon me, and I thank my side for their full support. And can I thank you, Speaker, and well done on your elevation to the high office of Speakership. I'm sure us on both sides, you have bipartisan support in your new role today. Full confidence from both sides. From little things, big things grow. These are the words written about Vincent Lingiari, the song that we all listen to. I look around the room and I see those words reflected in each and every member here today. Of course, that's about the Wave Hill Walk-Off, a very important time in our history, which really sparked a revolution in terms of our people's rights and the movement for freedom. We all come from different backgrounds. Some of us are from Queensland, some of us are from New South Wales. I know I got in trouble about that on Sunday, and we'll see how we go on Wednesday week anyway. I've been lucky enough to meet some of my own mob here, very surprisingly, from my Gomeroi mob. Really good to see you guys around here too. Of course, I did go for the Blues for Origin, but there's worse offenders. We have people from Victoria, of course, and given they go for AFL and it's a completely different league, I think my crime is less of a crime than that crime. And I may remind people that, of course, in 1788 we didn't have state borders, so of course the state of Queensland didn't always exist, and certainly my tribe and my people would have been a part of modern day Queensland. So I'm definitely a Queenslander today, and I've chosen the red tie for that reason. But coming to the program, a lot of us came full of passion. We came with energy from our communities. We've been grassroots members of our local communities, and we get things done. We use our voice and we're deadly. A lot of other people came to the program without that passion, but they've come here to find that passion. Whether it's to find culture, find connections, network and communicate, I think we can all agree that we've certainly done that. We've demonstrated that to the best of our ability this week. We'll all walk away stronger from this program. Whether you came in strong, whether you came in looking to develop strength, we're all walking away stronger, and we'll share that. And we'll share these relations for the rest of our life. We've made lifelong friendships and connections. It's that ball of light that's within us, and it's growing stronger and stronger. And I think together we can certainly prove that. Yeah. However, we will hear from those opposite. Unfortunately today, they'll start spouting about housing and how we can get things fixed. They come in here with band-aid solutions, and this leader of the opposition, wanting to form government sitting as the alternative, doesn't provide an alternative solution. We get band-aid
members
solutions.
to my left.
Thank you, Speaker. We get band-aid solutions from those opposite, unfortunately, trying to come in here and dictate the policies of this successful Bloom government. And so we on this side will tell you today why we don't vote for the motion on housing proposed by those opposite. They have the temerity to come in here and propose ridiculous solutions. I mean, it could make a cat laugh, that's one of my quotes, but more like a shiver looking for a spine to run up with the integrity of this leader of the opposition.
Order. Sorry, please resume your seat. What is your point of order?
Personal offence.
Youth Premier, the member has taken personal offence to those comments, and also some of the language could be deemed unparliamentary. I ask you to withdraw.
Thank you, Speaker. In deference to you, I withdraw. Look, 30 years since the Mabo decision, 30 years since Redfern Park speech by Paul Keating. Much has been achieved in those 30 years. That's why we're here today. That's why we've been here this week. But there's much more to be achieved, and that's why we're here today and this week. And I think when we go back into our communities, that's the work that we will indeed do. In the words of Gough Whitlam, maintain your rage and enthusiasm. We'll see some of that today. There might be some division over housing policy today, but we will be united in finding common ground and common sense solutions for the issues that face each and every one of us today, as Queenslanders, as Australians, as mob. In that way, we are united. I urge the House to support the motion moved by the government, and do not support the motion moved by the opposition. From little things, big things grow. I commend this motion to the House.
I call the Youth Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Youth crime, mental health, housing, incarceration, transport, child safety and employment. These are some of the biggest issues we face as a state. For years, grassroots and systematic work has taken place to drive positive change in these sectors for all Queenslanders. However, we need to stop, look at our foundations and make them strong again. But before we continue doing this and building our state, we need to be reflective. How do we do this? I believe it is through deep healing, which leads to reconciliation. This starts by putting our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander needs at the forefront. 1, because we are overrepresented in every government sector. And 2, because our people are the foundation on which this country was built, the sovereign owners. By addressing our overrepresentation, through a modern, cultural and Indigenous perspectives lens, we naturally impact and address all issues plaguing the systems. It's a ripple effect or a butterfly effect. To begin a process like this, we must first deeply understand ourselves as mob, then acknowledge that non-Indigenous people also bring a form of culture to the table. A mentor once told me that culture is more than dancing and language. It runs deeper than that. It's innately who we are. We as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are community-minded. We are intuitive. We are waiting people because we know opportunities come when they're ready, because they are guided by our old people and our spirits. Non-Indigenous people have culture too. They operate from a basis of safety and success. Neither way of operating is right or wrong. It just is. We must recognise and understand this as it allows us to change systems and structures. We need to play the long game, the smart game. We need to take our way of working collectively as mob and creatively enmesh this into Western systems to create harmony. We are living in the centre of change, and we, here in this room, have a responsibility to those who will come many generations after us. Being here, our voices have been raised, heard, validated and felt deeply. It feels good to exist in safe spaces. Our shoulders feel lighter and our hearts less burdened together. We have an opportunity now to action our collective voices, to have our voice enshrined in the Constitution, so they will no longer talk about us without us. For too long, our aunties, uncles, brother boys, sister girls have been silenced. But look to your left and look to your right. This chamber right here is full of blackfellas. This is our ancestors' wildest dreams. This fire, this passion, this anger is our power. Don't let it burn out. Let it dwindle if you must. Rest if you must. But don't let it smoulder. Lean on each other to keep that flame lit. Because together, if we keep our fires burning, we are trailblazers. And never forget, always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
I call the Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that this young youth parliament acknowledge that First Nations successfully governed their lands, seas, water and air associated resources for at least 65,000 years prior to British colonisation of Queensland. Colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nations and often against the active resistance of First Nations peoples. First Nations have never ceded their sovereignty and continue to assert sovereignty. Colonisation occasioned devastating disruption to First Nations societies and the wholesale dispossession of First Nations peoples of their lands, seas, water and air. First Nations responsibilities for their lands, seas, waters and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. And finally, First Nations cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. As a proud Dungari and Camilleri man, I stand before everyone here today to voice unheard concerns regarding colonisation and the dispossession of Aboriginal land. First Nations people make up 3% of the population, yet 27% of those incarcerated.
Shame.
Furthermore, 50% of all young people in detention are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I would like to ask, what chance do our young people have? Acknowledging the 6 factors initially discussed, we had a government in place. We had sovereignty, we had responsibilities, to the land, seas and water and air. We had culture and knowledge, and we still do. However, that was affected by colonisation, which saw the introduction of disruptive substances such as drugs and alcohol. As a result, our youth are hurting, and they need help, not to be locked up and taken away from their homes. Recently, I was given the privilege to meet with a wise man by the name of Simon Butcher, who spoke to me about the Lockhart River, a community located in far north Queensland. To this day, his community continues to struggle with issues such as poor water, limited access to food, addiction to drugs and alcohol, violence, and the list goes on. Therefore, our people are struggling with our basic necessities that so many people in Australia take for granted. So considering this story, we must create change. We must stand up for those who don't have the opportunities we have. Thus, I propose we push to increase the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14 and incorporate justice reinvestment. This process is where money spent on prisons is redirected into spending money on communities. Money would be then spent on diversionary programs, situational crime prevention, better health services, youth programs, and more, which targets creating healthier and happier youth before crime occurs. Moreover, increasing the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14 would allow more time for these programs implemented to take place. Otherwise, we see exponential rates of recidivism in our youth, and they continue to be in and out of the system. For these reasons, I implore you to stop being silent and instead be loud. We live in a world where technology plays such a major part in our daily lives and is a key tool to changing these issues. If you can change the view of two people each, you can change the world. We are living our ancestors' wildest dreams, so don't be silent, be deadly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Shadow Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a proud Torres Strait Islander from the Aikadal clan, I am pleased to support the government motion that was presented by the Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. I draw to attention the previously mentioned causes from 1 to 6 by the Youth Minister to emphasise on the necessity of a respected relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, land and culture, and the government. Respectful to the true history of our land, First Nations have been resisting colonisation since British settlement. On behalf of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I would like to formally say we are still resisting. Clauses 1 to 6 clearly state the prominence between First Nations and the government to our land. I understand the government's relatively recent appreciation and governmental efforts that have contributed to reconciliation within the last 30 years. However, as an emerging Indigenous leader and a young Black woman who has first-hand experience on the impact of your colonisation on our country, I can confidently state the impacts still reverberate to this day. Furthermore, I would like to articulate the severity of Clause 6 to First Nation peoples. Not only is our culture and knowledge, like stated in Clause 6, a resource of Queensland, it is an integral element to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individual identities. To efficiently understand the importance of what needs to be acknowledged, as an individual, I ask you to look further within yourselves and critically evaluate your position of power and the means of how you got there. First Nation peoples were here before. We were dispossessed. We are here now, and it is still happening. We will still be here. We will be recognised. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Member for Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion of colonisation occurred without consent for the First Nation peoples and often against active resistance of First Nation peoples. In addition to this motion, we take the time to understand 65,000 years of First Nation peoples' history and culture. It's recognised the systems weren't designed for Indigenous Australians. In the beginning of colonisation, First Nation peoples wasn't consulted with, which means we didn't consent to this. Our elders fought hard for the rights and recognitions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Our elders also paved the path for upcoming generations. I stand before my fellow participants and state that we are here to support and represent the change of for our people and our communities. We continue to fight for our ancestors and elders. In this moment of change, we seek to have a voice and have equal partnerships in the Constitution. We work in partnerships with government and provide appropriate change for what our people deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Rose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw the attention to the House to First Nations culture and knowledge on how it is an enormous resource for Queensland. First Nations culture and knowledge is lacking in the education curriculum. Our culture and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland as it can break through cultural identity and language barriers, especially in our remote communities. Furthermore, it can assist with educating non-Indigenous students and teachers to help break through these barriers. For these reasons, we propose that First Nations culture and knowledge is embedded in the education curriculum. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion that First Nations responsibilities for their lands, seas, waters and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you about my family back on Mornington Island, Lytle land. We still practice our culture on country. We look after our land and seas and it looks after us. We only take what we need to provide for our families. We respect each other's boundaries and ask for permission. We respect our elders and their decision-making process. From this, I learned we each play a part in our society and each have a responsibility to continue to practice our laws and customs. Consequently, I urge the House to acknowledge that First Nations responsibilities for their lands, seas, waters and airs continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Paris. Youth member for Manalong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion of First Nations cultures and the knowledge and how it is an enormous resource for Queensland. Mr. Speaker, in my community of Townsville, there is a significant number of First Nations people who have a lack of cultural identity and knowledge. There is also evidence of non-Indigenous Australians' lack of understanding of First Nations culture. First Nations education is key for the future of Queensland. As a future parent, I would like to see First Nations education for all of Queensland. I would like to see this so that culture can continue for my child and future generations to come. I hope that in the future, with the help of First Nations education, my child will not experience a loss of cultural identity and discrimination. This is why the notion of First Nations cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak in support of Section 1 of the motion moved by the Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Youth Partnerships. First Nations people successfully governed their land, waters, air, and associated resources for at least 65,000 years prior to colonisation. The reciprocity of caring for country as country cares for you is a fundamental principle of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of life and living. In spite of the effects of colonisation, we are still here today, living by that law. In spite of the efforts to hold us down, we continue to rise. In spite of the efforts to incarcerate us, to breed out our blackness, to take our children, our land, our culture, our pride and our power, we continue to thrive, succeed and defy those expectations. This always was and always will be the lands of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Carmody.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Education is key. If one seeks to influence real change in their communities, they must have the capacities to battle within those arenas. We know what our young people are capable of. Government departments know what they're capable of and acknowledge the utility of their cultural authenticity. The Queensland Government wants more First Nations people leading changes across roles in those departments. Therefore, we must prioritise education to allow the next generation the toolkit for navigating these institutions. They need to contribute to these positive benefits within their community. Indigenous knowledges and experiences are an essential resource for Queensland to thrive in the future. Thank you, Speaker.
I call the youth member for Sailor. Call the youth member for Anu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support Clause 4 of the motion presented by the Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. Colonisation disrupted First Nations societies and the wholesale dispossession of First Nations peoples of their land, seas, water and air. 1788 was the beginning of disruption for Australia's First Nations peoples' complex systems and connection to culture. Mr. Speaker, Australia has been ignorant to the effects of this disarrangement, still seeing long-lasting effects such as lack of identity, loss of culture, institutionalised racism and intergenerational traumas. Mr. Speaker, I have seen the effects it has had on me, my family and my community. First Nations peoples have continuously been oppressed throughout the history of Australia. Australia has a black history, now tainted with a history full of segregation, isolation, genocide and the displacement of First Nations peoples. Mr. Speaker, we must not be ignorant anymore to protect the continuity of culture and to support the healing of our First Nations peoples. This always was and always will be the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Sailor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion for colonisation occasioned devastating disruption to First Nations society and the wholesale dispossession of First Nations societies, peoples of their lands, seas, waters and air. Introducing First Nations society to diseases, alcohol and drugs, trauma, dispossession of land, culture, language and the forcible removal of children. Mr. Speaker, these effects are still felt today. We see this through the overrepresentation of our First Nations people in prisons, statistics of the health gap between First Nations people. As a health worker, Mr. Speaker, I've witnessed these health gaps through family members, through communities, adults, children, and myself as an individual. We need to do better. Previous Closing the Gap reports have missed the mark, evidently. I was in high school when my great-grandparents passed. They were taken from their homelands in Cape York and sent to Palm Island. My great-grandfather was a toddler when he was forced alongside his family to make the 3-week trek from Cape York to Lucinda, where he was put on a boat to Palm Island. Mr. Speaker, this needs to be acknowledged before we can address, and that's why I support this motion. Thank you.
I call the youth member for Smith. Call the youth member for Page.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I am supporting the motion, and in particular Limb 5, First Nations responsibilities for their land, seas, waters and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. Mr. Speaker, you have seen the consequences when us as First Nation people have not had the responsibility of our own land, seas, waters and air. These are not just physical components, but they mean so much more. Our land used for celebrations and connections to culture. Our seas and water brings unity and connects us all together throughout Australia. Our air providing life and nutrients for our people. I have had the opportunity to grow up on my own land in Charters Towers, and what a gift it was. It brought me strength, resilience and humility. My father would often take us to the properties where our grandparents were raised, bringing stories of my elders alive, feeling connected to my land. Unfortunately, this is not the case for my youngest sister, who has been moved from her land recently. And it saddens me that she will not feel the very thing that brought me strength, resilience and humility myself. Mr. Speaker, if this is what has happened to my sister, I fear what would happen to a community. For this House to acknowledge these steps, it's an important step forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
What is your point of order?
I'd like to raise the attention.
Thank you, member. I was going to just call the member for Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the motion and would like to draw comment on limb number 4, that colonisation occasioned devastating disruption to First Nations societies and the wholesale dispossession of First Nations peoples of their lands, seas, water and air. Mr. Speaker, I stand here today proudly as a Gudjala woman from the land of Charters Towers. But Mr. Speaker, apart from a name and a place, I don't even know what that means. And I'm not the only one. Colonisation flogged, and I mean this literally, flogged the language out of my great-grandfather in the streets of Charters Towers. If this motion is moved, I envision societal change will follow, and we will finally start our process of truth-telling. If this motion is moved, I see a vision that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth will no longer struggle with valuing who they are, where they're from, and what they can achieve. I see a vision that this value will no longer be questioned by themselves or by the citizens of Queensland otherwise. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Dodson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion Limb 6, which is First Nations cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Mr. Speaker, my kindergarten to year 12, I attended a school where I was one of a few Indigenous kids that went there. I can only count the amount of times on one hand where my culture was taught and or acknowledged. I had no sense of cultural identity, and the only way for me to understand was through my elders and family. This is not enough. There's not enough representation in schools, more specifically private schools. Mr. Speaker, it disheartens me to say that I was faced with many hardships. I couldn't be proud of who I was because I didn't understand who I was. I always felt there was a divide and this was never addressed. There was not enough education to the non-Indigenous people, and this resulted in lack of support and understanding. I fear that there will be a lack of cultural competency and connection in our younger generation. My hope for the younger generation is that while they strive and go through this education journey that is a massive part of life, they are also being taught about First Nations people and the importance of our history and understanding who they are without question. This is the reason why I support this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Christian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Section 5 for First Nations people. Us as First Nations people, we do have the responsibilities for the land and the sea. Because we as First Nations people have cultural obligations in order to protect the land and the sea because of sacred sites. That's why it is important also to follow the rule that was provided by our elders, because we must follow the tradition and the laws and the customs that's been handed down to us, and because our land we must protect, and also the kinship, and we must respect because the spirit of our ancestors are still there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Lingari. I call the youth member for 4 Mile.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Section 2 of the government motion. Colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nations and often against the active resistance of First Nations peoples. Prior to graduating high school in 2014, I had little to no education surrounding foundational skills such as writing resumes and addressing selection criteria. Due to the unconsensual colonisation of our First Nations, Indigenous youth in remote Indigenous communities and also within communities in city regions today do not have the knowledge and understanding of these fundamental skills, therefore have less of an opportunity to secure employment. Mr. Speaker, my ancestors fought to be where we are today, and we are still facing the implications caused by colonisation throughout our lives. We need to work together with our First Nations peoples to abolish the implications that myself and many other First Nations peoples are forced to overcome. These fundamental skills should be embedded in the education so that the future generation can transition into the workforce. Mr. Speaker, this should not still be playing an active role in our First Nations lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak the motion that colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nation people and often against the active resistance of First Nation people. Colonisation occasioned devastating disruption to our societies. This occasion has a very big impact on myself and my family. My family is the result of a stolen generation and the blackbirding of Pacific Islanders. Being a part of 2 big disruptions has put shame, anger, and confusion and a loss of identity on not just the older generations, but my generation, as a lot of us have grown up trying to figure out who we are. My grandmother, 3 generations before me, was taken from Dalby because of her fair skin. My grandfather was taken from the Solomon Islands and brought to Mackay to work on the cane fields. The effect of colonisation is long-term. And as young people, we need to ensure our elders and our voices are accurately heard. By acknowledging the term voice, the Uluru Statement from the Heart is one great initiative we can help push into motion. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to not have a voice on the land that we had cared for thousands of years is extremely painful. The Uluru Statement is about having a voice and a seat at the table. A seat at the table to create change for our people and to be included. I hope the invitation of the statement is considered in our government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Hayman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion of the colonisation's disruption to First Nations societies and disposition of First Nations people's lands, sea, water and air. Mr. Speaker, this not only affects First Nations people, it affects all of Australia, as things like commercial fishing, unsustainable farming, exhausting natural resources, pollution and mining associate with climate change and loss of resources for Australia. First Nations people still practice traditions and laws that have taken care of Australia's natural environment and inhabitants for thousands of years. Only since colonisation has it devastatingly declined, as we witness through rising temperatures and rising sea levels, which are sinking the Torres Strait Islands, also a lack of natural resources, which lead us to relying on international resources. Protecting sacred sites and allowing Indigenous law solutions to merge into Western law for an inclusive and widespread approach on this problem. For this House to acknowledge these facts is an important step forward into reconciliation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any youth members wishing to speak on this motion before putting the motion? The question is that the motion moved by the Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no. I think the ayes have it. I call the Youth Shadow Minister for Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this Parliament endorses the following measures to address the housing crisis in Queensland. Anyone buying a second property in Queensland must pay double stamp duty, and the funds generated must be used to build social housing in Queensland. Anyone under the age of 35 who purchases a property in Queensland must pay a 10% levy to fund housing for the elderly and disabled. And where elderly people live, are living alone in a multi-bedroom dwelling, the government will encourage them to rent their extra rooms to young people by creating an app to match people with extra rooms with young people who need accommodation, and by subsidising the rent paid by the young person. For example, if the market rental value of a room is $200 per week, the government will pay the homeowner $50 per week, and the tenant would pay the other $150. Rental charges may be further offset by the provision of services by the tenant, such as lawn mowing, dog walking, cleaning, and cooking. I would like everyone here to ask themselves, what is a house and what is a home? A stone's throw away is Kiuti and the Indigenous services, which is named for Udjuru Knuckle. Her most famous poem, We Are Going. The campfires are gone, the kangaroos and wallabies are gone, the burrow rings are gone, and we are going. Growing up, I saw the effects of what having a house in your greatest time of need can do. My grandmother supported those in her community, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, when they needed a place to stay, a meal to eat. It is, as I passed through those halls and I met the people, whether they're young mothers with their babies or a young man needing a place to stay, they would say thank you to me and to my nana for creating this house. And I never questioned it. It is seen that there is a disproportionate amount of Indigenous families that do not own their own home. We can see that a house is something that adds to equity, contributes to generational wealth, something that is also lacking in Indigenous families due to systemic removal of wages. We have the stolen wages. With this house, you can see that it's creating a foundation for support. Currently, as shown by the Queensland Council of Social Services, there are 50,000 households currently waiting for social housing. When someone is turned away, those most vulnerable, such as women and children, they are returning to domestic violence situations and living in cars with newborns because there is nowhere else to go. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Dingo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to first address why are we limiting the growth of our working class, those who are our lifeblood, and those who are the main investors for Queensland. The opposition has the absurd notion that we must take. We already take so much. We do not need to take any more. It should be the responsibility of those It should not be the responsibility of those trying to grow when there are multi-billion-dollar companies and mining companies who aren't paying their fair share. Make them responsible. Mr. Speaker, the motion led by the opposition goes against everything government stands for. And it shows why, perhaps this shows why they are the opposition and not government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Malone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have noticed in my community, due to lack of properties, many families are having to live in an overcrowded home. Mr. Speaker, it can take years before people can be successful in receiving social housing. This forces many to move from their respective community and relocate to the mainland, leaving behind family and cultural connections. Mr. Speaker, my name is Jacqueline Mao. I am a proud Torres Strait Islander of the Deeral clan. I rise to speak on the housing crisis in the Torres Strait. Having the initiative to develop social housing will take stress of families experiencing these issues and empowering them to remain in community where the connections are strong. Mr. Speaker, if you move to endorse this motion, for anyone buying a second property in Queensland must pay double stamp duty, and the funds generated must be used to build social housing in Queensland, my party would support this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Baker.
Thank you, Speaker. I draw attention to the House to the ludicrous notion presented by the opposition and contend that such implementation of legislation will create avenues for disaster that should not be passed. Consequently, at the passing of this bill, our opposition is willing to put our most vulnerable at risk. Elder abuse is already prevalent in Australian society, and implementing Section 3 of this motion enables such discrimination already present in contemporary Australian society. More importantly, this motion rejects the structural barriers preventing young people and lower class citizens from owning, developing and investing in property, and relinquishes the already difficult economic climate that prevents young people's development in Australia. The implementation of Section 2 is inequitable and presents further challenges to the future generations of our nation. Finally, the failure of the opposition to identify the root of the problem is just simply laughable. Simply laughable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To pass accountability from government to citizens is an embarrassing take on behalf of the opposition and is in fact an elitist regime that will set our nation back.
Order. Leader of the Opposition. Member for Baker, you have the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is our responsibility in positions of power in government to influence and protect our people. So why pass the burden to the most vulnerable people in our society, when we ourselves in government have our pockets lined, sitting in a gold parliamentary chamber? Take accountability for this motion, for the motion the opposition intends to pass. Do we not work for the people? Must we not keep our people in our best interests? Apparently not. Apparently not, indeed. We need to reflect the people in our hearts and reflect it in our legislation. Reject this motion by the opposition and stay in touch with reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Tapsell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Australian population is encumbered by crises that stretch far beyond a viral pandemic. Citizens from all ages, all over, are burdened by the housing crisis we are currently living in. Young adults are feeling the brunt of their housing affordability and availability hardship, exhausting any and all available supports to them to stand on their own 2 feet. I'd like to inform the House that according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, access to good quality and affordable housing is fundamental to one's well-being. This data also shows that at least 13% of elderly Australians are feeling loneliness and social isolation, which has detrimental effects on mental and physical well-being, which leads to premature mortality and morbidities. Mr. Speaker, implementing the motion for elderly Australians to enable safe and affordable housing to the younger population can bridge the gap between a housing crisis and better health outcomes for all involved. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Barney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the opposition bringing upon such a ludicrous and outrageous motion clearly shows a lack of empathy and understanding for the housing position as a whole. The difference of values, needs and wants between these two parties is far, far too great for them to live together in harmony. This is only going to end in detriment and struggle, and at worst could even make the housing issue further down the worse. Definitely. For them to even suggest such a outlandish, out there motion, it's just, I'm sorry, I'm lost for words. Because they clearly haven't spoken to the youth about this, nor the elderly. If they did, they would know. They would know how bad of an idea this is. They would know how it's going to end. They would know that this is only adding to the issue of elderly abuse. They would know that this could be detrimental for the communities that the elderly are based in. How would you like it if you were an elderly, aged 60 to 70, and you had some youth in your neighbourhood, in your house, causing a ruckus, having a party, destroying your home that you've lived in for half a century? I'm truly lost. Thank you, Speaker.
I call the youth member for Williams-Weir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to speak on Opposition Motion 1 regarding double stamp duty and social housing. For me, it is incredibly clear that this motion would change many Queenslanders' lives, and here's why. Imagine you're a scared 17-year-old young mother to a beautiful 2-year-old boy.
You try day in, day out to provide for him the best you can with the little support that you have. You had to escape home because at the hands of your own mother, you've experienced significant family violence. You flee with your son and your belongings packed tightly into a small backpack and end up at an overcrowded relative's house. Mr. Speaker, this young girl's son doesn't have his own bed, his toys broken and taken by other children within the household, and there is not enough food. With the support of local youth workers like myself, this young mum filed for an application to her local housing centre, however was told that there would be a 12-month to a 3-year wait. A 3-year wait, Mr. Speaker. Up to 3 years of continuing to live in an overcrowded household or continuing to be objected to family violence. As a result, it is clear to see that there are not only young mums at risk, but so many more people with this same shared experience that will continue if we don't act now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Lindgren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the attention of the House of the current crisis surrounding housing. This government, under Premier Bloom, is committed to doing something about this crisis. We do not let people stay out on the streets. We have invested money into the housing sector. The other thing I'd like to raise is this really revenue for the opposition? Because from what it seems on this side of the chamber is that we are committed. As I've said, we are investing money in housing. But while the opposition can point fingers at us and tell us that, we've got to wait 12 to 3 years for something, I find this ludicrous. It is absolutely horrific that they'd say something like that when we are most committed to this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Namatjira.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 30,000 people. 30,000 people in crisis are currently on the waitlist for social housing in Queensland. Let that sink in. To be eligible and approved for social housing, it needs to be assessed that you are unable to access or sustain a tenancy in the private market. This is to ensure that only our most at-risk Queenslanders are being housed in the limited stock available. Once approved for social housing, after the long and complicated application process, it can take months or even years to be appropriately housed. When people are attending their local housing service centre, they are in need for immediate housing solutions. They are needing housing today, not next year. The reality is that social housing is designed to house people long term, most likely until it is their time to leave this world. Which is great. It means that people who are housed do not have to worry about experiencing homelessness again. However, this also means that there is not a high turnover of properties. We are desperately in need of building new social housing. I am pleased to support the motion that anyone buying a second property in Queensland must pay double stamp duty. And the funds generated must be used to build social housing across Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Malman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support motion 1 regarding double stamp duty to support social housing. I strongly agree with motion 1. I believe investors and homeowners need to keep at the forefront of their minds that they are truly privileged. They are privileged to have the opportunity to invest. The investors should be contributing back into the economy to cater for those who do not have this privilege, who are not financially stable to be in these positions. Personally, I know firsthand as a homeowner myself, I am extremely privileged. I am privileged to have a roof over my head. I am privileged to sleep in a bed at night. Now imagine, you don't have this. You don't have a home to go to each night. Furthermore, having the opportunity to be one of these investors, giving not only to the economy, but helping to provide these young people, everyone that does not have a home. This we are privileged to have the moral responsibility to give the opportunity to build these up. Imagine knowing you got a family off the streets into a safe, warm home where they are safe. In conclusion, these are a few of the reasons why I 100% support the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Tapoti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In everyday lives, we see how bad the housing crisis is. Nowadays, everything has gone up in prices: food, fuel, utilities, and a lot more. However, the pay rate is not going up. How is a young adult meant to move out? I strongly agree with this motion. If people are getting $800 a week and they have to pay $200 rent, that only leaves them with $600 for the week. If the government pays $50 per week to help out, this means that $50 can go to food, fuel, or utilities. The cost of living has gone up, and I believe that it will only get worse in the future. Having something like this to help young adults be independent. I am for supporting young adults in this housing crisis by paying $50 a week to help their rent and their housing.
I call the youth member for Thaiday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a representative, supporter and voice for the Youth Shadow Minister for Housing, I support and endorse the following measure to address the following of housing crisis in the state of our state, Queensland. With our current homeless crisis within the youth and the increase of our elderly suffering with a mental health illness and subsequent health-related impacts by reasons of social isolation, disconnectedness, and loneliness. Mr. Speaker, I would like to countersign Motion 3 of where elderly people are living alone in multi-bedroom dwelling, the government will encourage them to rent their extra rooms to young people by creating an app to match people with extra rooms with young people who need accommodation, and by subsidising the rent paid by young people. For example, if the market rent value of the room is $200 per week, the government will pay the homeowner $50 per week, and the tenant will pay others $150. Rental charges may further offset by the provision of services by the tenant, such as lawn mowing, dog walking, and cleaning, etc. Mr. Speaker, this notion will build respect and it will benefit both relationships between both parties. Implementing this motion will endorse and create harmony, and it will endorse us to contribute into living as one, as Australians and as mob. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Unaipon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to raise the opposition motion, Section 1 for the opposition motion. I think this motion is a very good idea. I am currently living a household of 9 people across 3 generations of my family. We have 1 bathroom and 3 bedrooms. My father-in-law has to sleep in the lounge room. We all have different values. Some smoke, some don't. We want to raise our child in our own way, in our own home, without distraction from people with different values, habits, and behaviors. We want our children to be free and to have their own space. Currently, we feel trapped. We have no option to move into our own home. This motion could help us in our situation and many others in similar situations. We need more social housing in Queensland, and this motion could help with measures to generate funds to build more housing.
I call the youth member for Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Our elderly population make up 60% of Australia's total population. That's 4.2 million people and counting. More than 1 out of 10 of the elderly population experience depression. What are the main causes? Social isolation. Therefore, I would like to draw the attention of the House to Clause 3, Youth Integrated Housing for the Elderly. Encouraging them to rent the extra rooms of their house to our youth will become a stepping stone for social isolation prevention. Subsidising the rent for our youth tenants will also encourage them to embrace this initiative as well. As a result, we will see a decrease in elderly depression, mental issues, and social isolation. A decrease in youth homelessness will also be prevalent. It also provides a role model for them to be inspired and informed. Our elderly population were and always will be contributing members of our society and our nation. Let them rest happy, safe, and surrounded by people they love. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Plum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion of requesting investors to pay double stamp duty when buying a second house. Members of this House, I invite you to walk down the city of our streets and see our Queenslanders in the cold, curled up on the curbside. Now, you tell me that we don't need more social housing. Investors that are in the position to buy a second home in this economy have a moral responsibility to contribute and look after the people of our state. We need change to help the vulnerable people of this state. We need safety and a place for people to call home. By raising the stamp duty cost for investors, we can generate more funding to create more availability of safe, warm beds. I want to ask everyone in this room today if a roof over your head is a basic human need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Queensland is an absolute housing crisis, and if we don't act now, we're going to see more Queenslanders and my mob on the streets. Our state is growing more each year, and we need to act now. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to support the motion of double stamp duty on second homes purchased. The people buying second homes are usually in better financial states and should be able to afford this extra duty. In 2020, QCSS reports on average there are about 28-month wait periods for people waiting on housing. With 50,000 plus already in social housing and another 50,000 waiting on that list. Our mob need houses and they need them now. There's also a report that there are 15,000 children homeless, in the cold, no food, and we need to create opportunity for our people. With the duty paid for social housing, we can create more jobs, and this will get people opportunity to be in the industry to build more housing for our people. Overcrowding in houses and health and well-being issues create many issues in our lives. It's a necessity to have a home, and no one deserves to sleep on the street. Having a home will give families opportunity to contribute to society more meaningfully. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there anyone wishing to speak on the motion that has not yet done so? I call the Youth Premier.
Speaker, I rise just to add final contributions, and amazing to see such passionate debate about an amazing topic here, and very well done to the rest of you in the chamber today. But let's review this motion. Let's not play politics with this. Double stamp duty for your second home, 10% levy for those under 35, which are most of us here, and forcing elderly to live with young. One of my quotes, common sense is a flower that doesn't grow in everyone's garden, and clearly those opposite have demonstrated that quote today.
Order. Members to my left will cease their interjections. Youth Premier would help with the inflammatory commentary would be kept to a minimum.
Thank you, Speaker.
You have the call.
I commend the opposition for attempting to do good. I commend the Shadow Minister for tabling this motion before the House, and very well done. However, as I've mentioned, the solutions provided do not go far enough. They pale in comparison to this government's response for social housing. I reference my honourable member there in terms of the Bloom government's investment in record housing at this stage, and the opposition's amendments that have been proposed, the opposition's motion that's been proposed before the House, doesn't get back to the core of common sense. Which is what I mentioned in my very first speech, that we need to come up with common sense solutions. So therefore, I urge the House, all members, opposition and government, to vote in the right place and vote no against this motion. We don't need this motion in order to build social housing. We need to get behind the policies of the Bloom government and continue the trend which we are already achieving and breaking our goals to end this homelessness crisis. Thank you, Speaker. I thank the House.
The question is that the motion moved by the Youth Shadow Minister for Housing be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no. No. I think the noes have it.
Divide.
A division has been called. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Close the bars. The question is that the motion be agreed to for which a division has been called. The government whip commence counting. The opposition whip commence counting.
I'm just, hey, could we have some clarification as to what just occurred? I think we're a little bit lost in terms of voting.
The voting arrangements, member, have been changed in Queensland for some time, where people remain in their seat to be counted. The votes are tallied and delivered. We no longer need to physically cross the chamber, and some of that was due to COVID-19 restrictions, but ultimately people will remain in place. If the tellers are finished, I'll ask the government whip to advise what the government votes are for the ayes or noes.
Mr. Speaker, there is 23 ayes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You're certain they're ayes? I think you may mean noes.
I meant no.
Thank you, member. Will the opposition whip advise what the opposition votes are for the ayes or noes?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've got 24 ayes.
Honourable members, ordinarily the government would win the vote. In this case, there are members of the government missing. It may go to discipline of the whips to ensure that the numbers in the House are in the government's favour in the future. The question is resolved in the affirmative. The motion passes. The question is that the House to now adjourn. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against, no. I call the youth member for Myers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the issue of the lack of government funding for sporting opportunities in remote communities. In my community of Mount Isa, we have a lot of raw talent that do not get do not get exposed to the opportunities like Southeast Queensland. For us to compete and progress, we have to travel a vast distance and rely on community sponsorship to afford fuel and accommodation. Therefore, I encourage for you to hear me out so that our next generation of leaders and athletes have more hope in pursuing their goals and realize just because you come from a community, it doesn't mean you can't dream big. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Simon. I call the youth member for Goolagong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to share what the House is youth crime in North Queensland. Youth crime has been happening in North Queensland, and it is bad because I've personally seen my younger brother go into youth detention centre over time. In addition from the issue, I think there should be more engaging programs that could run like footy, basketball and like volleyball competitions and fundraise towards themselves so they can be engaged more and occupied. This solution would be good for the youths to help them keep healthy, fit, build good relationships and even learn networking. For this reason, I believe youth crime will decrease and get youths back on track with education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Bonner. I call the youth member for Cassadale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the issue of employment. I'm sure this isn't just an issue within my community, but across Queensland. I'm a Jabaganji woman from Kuranda, located in the Cairns region. On a daily basis, the struggle of Aboriginal youth not being able to get a job because of the lack of the training and skills needed for the positions being offered. That results in the lack of jobs being available to suit individual career ambitions and supportive work environments. To help with developing skills to advance, I believe running a training program within my community to help Indigenous youth with upskilling. I call on the government to establish setting up a training facility for youth to access training resources that's needed for their employment journey, which results in the increase of Indigenous youth employment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Chilborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, Queensland was rocked with devastating floods that left many people displaced statewide. As a Gympie girl born and raised, I watched my community crumble, and the support for its residents has been shocking. In fact, thus far, it has been null. Zero, zilch, nothing. Gympie's businesses have already received financial assistance from the Queensland Government, but what about its people? What about the countless individuals and families that are now roaming the streets? And what about all the people that cannot get into the rental or housing markets because of the outrageous prices? The state budgets were released not too long ago, and Gympie was excluded from receiving any support whatsoever in regards to housing. That record funding that will build 1,200 homes statewide, a drop in the ocean compared to Queensland's housing crisis, by the way. And Gympie receives nothing. A town as run down and desperate as Gympie has been neglected. The community itself has taken its own measures. It has opened a recently closed trailer park. It has reopened it for the homeless. But I ask you this, Mr. Speaker, who wants to live in a dirty, crowded trailer park? Would you? No. It's not safe, it's not hygienic. I wouldn't. And I don't want to see my family and friends back in Gympie living there. I stand with the member for Gympie, Mr. Tony Perrott, and I agree with what he said in this chamber not too long ago. This blatant neglect for Gympie is ridiculous, and it is unacceptable. The Queensland Government needs to step up and provide adequate funding and support for towns such as Gympie. Thank you.
I call the youth member for Mao.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm from a proud community up top in Cape York called Pomprown. Today I would like to share with the House some of the issues that are affecting my community, such as drugs, alcohol, and family domestic violence. These issues I've witnessed with my own eyes on numerous occasions. I have seen firsthand the damage it can do to my families and all the other families in the community. Mr. Speaker, I would like to see more programs implemented focusing on education to address these issues, which will lead to more opportunities for all community members. In conclusion, this is why we need funding to support the development of facilitation of the programs. This will provide equal opportunity and better place for Pomprown, but not just for my community, but for all communities in Cape York. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You call the youth member for Roche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Law of the land. Today I want to share with the House an issue that affects that is present within my community, the Fraser Coast, and affects other communities in Queensland. It is the inadequate protection of local ecosystems due to a lack of First Nations consultation and a lack of Indigenous ecological surveying roles within local governments. The lack of consultation is resulting in the destruction of significant ecosystems such as wetlands, reefs, and coastal bushlands, as well as culturally significant sites. The recent dispositions of ecological surveying roles within local governments has created unaccountability within local land developing corporations, but now provides us with the opportunity to establish similar roles for Indigenous peoples to acknowledge scientific and traditional values for our local ecology, just as our ancestors have done so for 60,000 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the major concern of restricted access to health facilities within rural communities of Queensland. It will be said that Indigenous Australians typically die at much younger ages than other Australians and are more likely to experience disability and reduced quality of life because of ill health. Furthermore, having restricted access worsens this concern. The way people in rural and remote access primary health care often differs to others in metropolitan areas. For example, facilities are generally smaller, have less infrastructure, and provide a broader range of services to a more widely distributed population. Rural and remote populations also rely more on general practitioners to provide healthcare services due to less availability of local specialist services. Nevertheless, it would be vital for an implement of services such as multiple mobile health services to be provided for those rural and remote communities, so access is available and better health is provided. Mr. Speaker, take this into consideration as lives are at stake and change is overdue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I live in the electorate of McConnell in the central area of Brisbane. Access to education for people within the electorate is of great importance. It can be expensive to live within the inner city area, and students that study full-time deserve to be able to do so without hardship. Living on a limited income and with rent that could be $500 a week, Up to $40 a week on public transport doesn't come cheap. It can be quite costly to have to attend study full-time. A solution to the issue would be to provide free public transport for students, which would help to alleviate that pressure. Additionally, to help them, students, to get to work and to save.
I call the youth member for Leroy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw attention of the House about an issue that is affecting my region, northwest Queensland. Youth crime is a big issue within my community. Mr. Speaker, I have witnessed this firsthand. It is deeply heartbreaking to see a lot of my family members with a lot of potential leading down the wrong path and in prison to become another statistic on a piece of paper. This is why I believe my community of Mount Isa needs more funding for crime prevention programs to build up our youth, because we are the future. In conclusion, this will decrease the rate of youth crime in northwest Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hello, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to talk about my issues in my community, Cherbourg. The biggest issue in the youth is not finishing school. Mr. Speaker, I have realised that there is not enough Indigenous role models in the education sector. From my experience, Mr. Speaker, there is not enough teachers and teacher aides. Mr. Speaker, another good example would be to have more Indigenous policing, and because it would be understandable Indigenous issues and would be good in good spirits for their community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on an issue that is affecting my community right now. In Mission River Napperton. For me, the issue is lack of community engagement. There's a lot of youth crimes, drugs and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, family feuds, and disengagement from school, and nothing is being done. I've been living in my community.
Got this.
I've been living in my community ever since I was a little girl. And growing up around all these issues and seeing it's still an issue today makes me think that nobody cares about my mob and my community. I work as a sports and recreational officer at my local PCYC. And my role is to supervise, run activities after school, and engage within the community. The PCYC is a safe environment for young, troubled teenagers, and they don't have a role model to stand up for them. So I believe I could be that role model. I believe.
Got this, girl. Look this. You're amazing.
I believe that I can be that role model for my family back at home. Because no one is going to stand up for me and my family, my friends, and my community. And as a proud Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman from the Thanakwit clan, I believe that I can lead my people into a better future. And I know I can do it because I have the love and support from all my family back at home. Thank you.
Are there any members who have not spoken in the adjournment or have not spoken today that would like to do so? You certainly have an opportunity now. The question is, the House are now adjourned. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against, no. I think the ayes have it. Youth members, that ends the formalities of today's sitting, and the Sergeant at Arms will lead me out shortly, but I just wanted to make a few comments. The quality of your contributions today was outstanding. You should all be enormously proud of what you've been able to do. I think when I look at what you were doing with the preparation of your speeches and to see how you've actually come in and given them with such passion and with being very considered in your comments, you've done enormously well. So congratulations to all of you. You certainly deserve to feel very proud about that. I will also say that when I do sometimes see members in here who have done enormously well, I'd encourage you, as I said earlier, to continue to be involved in the democracy and in our processes of public administration or whatever it may be, because at the end of the day, if you, I guess, lose the skills that you've sort of learned this week or the things that you've been building on, it is hard to get back into that space. So leave here, go and do some things which will hopefully mean that you'll continue to build on, in your own personal development. But particularly the passion today was outstanding. It's one of the best debated motions we've had here, and it's a credit to all of you who were involved in that. Can I just very briefly say thank you to those involved in the program who've been supporting the program itself. Obviously to the non-speaking members today, clerks at the table, Sergeant at Arms, those attendants, thank you for the role that you've played. And of course to those people who are here as mentors, who are giving back after they've been the beneficiaries of the program itself. Obviously to Rebecca and Marjorie and our education team, thank you for what you've done. To the members who've been here today, we've had Amy McMahon, we've had John Paul Langbrook, and it's been great to be able to have members of Parliament showing genuine attention and wanting to be involved in helping to develop your skills as young people. And finally, again, thank you for all of your hard work. I know this has been a week-long exercise, and you've, as we've heard from the Youth Premier, there'll certainly be a lot of connections which will last a long time as a result. This program is one I'm very pleased to support as the Speaker of Parliament, and obviously you've heard from Marjorie a little earlier that we're taking what I've commenced a few years ago, a junior Indigenous Youth Parliament, which is normally shared between Cairns and Townsville. This year we're taking it to Thursday Island, which will be the first time that that's ever occurred. The great thing is that kids from the outer islands are all coming in to Thursday Island, and it'll be not only a Youth Parliament opportunity, but a great chance for that community to really come together and celebrate all of the things that make that part of the world so special. So this is going to be my second, the first of two Indigenous Youth Parliaments in a matter of weeks, and very much looking forward to going up there to enjoy. So thank you for your participation. Thanks for being so generous in terms of your support of each other, but particularly well done on giving some great speeches with an enormous amount of passion. With that, I adjourn the House.